Hi guys, welcome to the Warhammies, with me, your host, Seb. Today we're going to be painting Grey Knight Silver Armour using 4 paints. Before we get into this tutorial, we're going to need to run through what we're going to need. Firstly, you're going to need a Grey Knight model, primed, in Chaos Black. Next, we're going to require some Grey Knight Steel base paint, some Drakenhof Nightshade, layer paint Ironbreaker, and finally a layer paint of Stormhost Silver. In terms of brushes we're going to be using for this tutorial, I'm going to be using a small dry brush, medium brace brush, medium shade brush, medium layer brush, and a small layer brush. Not all these brushes are required for this method, but I'll talk you through when it's potentially useful to have them. In addition to that, you're going to need a palette. I'm just using a Tupperware container lid here, it does the job. And because we're going to be dry brushing, we're going to need some tissues rather than kitchen roll. Before we get into the video, I just want to show you some examples of what this method can achieve. Here we have a Grey Knight Librarian, Castellan Crow, and lastly I'll show you the Dread Knight, which allows me to show you the nice obvious method that we're going to be achieving. We want to have this nice deep blue and this nice shiny silver. So, onto the method. The first part of this tutorial is going to be applying a medium dry brush of Grey Knight Steel. We want to be able to coat the miniature so it's nice and silver. So, first things first, we'll open up our Grey Knight Steel. Because we're doing a dry brush, what we want to do, get a bit of paint on there, take it onto a bit of tissue, just want to be able to get it off. You don't want a lot on the brush, but you need enough that it's going to coat the miniature. So, when I go to start applying it, what we should see, we'll start at the legs. As we hit the model, what it should do is apply a nice coating. Now, if it's too wet, it's quite all right. Just go back over, go back to the tissue and take off a bit more of that moisture. You might need a few layers of this, just because it might come out quite dark the first time. But we're going to do this all over the miniature. Don't worry about getting little details covered, such as purity seals in the Grey Knight Silver. It's all right. What we're going to want to do is keep on applying it until we have a nice base. Now, the reason I prefer to dry brush rather than apply it via a base paint is just in terms of the speed you can get. It comes out in a similar quality at the end of the product. After applying a heavy dry brush of Grey Knight Steel, the model should be looking like this. That may take 1 or 2 coats to get to this level, but what I like to do now is get a medium base brush. And the reason for this is there's certain little points in the recesses of the miniature that can't be reached by the dry brush. It's important to note as well, it is difficult to dry brush the inside of the legs with these models due to their size, so I recommend getting the medium base brush to be able to do that. So, I'm going to load up our brush with some Grey Knight Steel. Remember to shake the pots regularly. Remember to wash your brushes and change your water regularly as well. So, load up our brush with a little bit, and all we're going to do is just get those recesses just in there. Just the areas where we think the dry brush could do with a little bit thicker. I'd recommend doing this down at the major parts of the model where the Drakenhof Nightshade is going to reach. Otherwise, it might come out incredibly dark. And we don't want the contrast to be too deep between the blue and the silver. We need a bit more on the brush there, but just go around the miniature, just patching up any little bits that need to be done. So guys, there we have the first stage of painting Grey Knights in my method complete. It's really important when going over with that medium base brush, when you go into the recesses, such as in the arms on the model, that it might also be worth touching up the main plate on the legs and sometimes on the helmet. Now the reason for this is that when we get to the next stage, shading with Drakenhof Nightshade, if the dry brush and the base isn't fully complete, sometimes it will come out a little bit too dark. So just make sure and take your time. And once it's all dried, we'll move on to the next stage. We're now moving on to the next stage of applying the shade paint of Drakenhof Nightshade to the miniature. So what we're going to be using is our medium shade brush. What I'm going to do, just make sure that Drakenhof Nightshade is nice and mixed, give it a good shake, and then apply it to the miniature. We're going to be applying a fair amount to the miniature because we want it all over so we can really get that blue effect going. Don't need to water it down, but make sure there's not too much on your brush because we don't want it to pool. So what we want to do is just pull it down. Keep on pulling it down all the way throughout the miniature. If you're finding it's pooling, just move it around a bit. Now, you want to do this all over the miniature. Don't be worried if it goes into the recesses. The main thing is to make sure there's not too much in the recesses that's going to take away from the full colour. This will help apply some shade to the model, but also it will help us really make that blue colour pop when we need it. Once the whole model's covered, we'll move in to the next stages. So that is the layer of Drakenhof Nightshade based over the whole mini. Now it's important to remember at this point, you've got to make sure that is dry before moving on to the next stage. You can potentially wait up to an hour, but you will find as it dries, this model will slowly go more and more blue. You want that, so when we move to the next stages, we get a lovely contrast between the blue and the silver. Once this model's dry, I'll see you for the next stage. Well, there we go. We've left the Drakenhof Nightshade to dry, and it's come out with this kind of dark blue steel effect. On to the third stage in the miniature now. What we're going to be doing is applying a layer of Ironbreaker to about the top 2/3 of the armour panel. And this will show us that nice silver to blue contrast. What we're going to want to do is load up a bit of Ironbreaker onto our brush. However, we want this to be nice and thinned down as we want it to be able to blend very nicely. So just make sure to get a little bit of water in there so we can apply some thin coats. But not too much because we don't want it to start taking off the shade paint. So, start on the leg as an example. What we have here, just slowly start brushing up the miniature. You can see there's not very much on my brush at all. It's just because when I start, I want to be able to get a nice feel for kind of how the effect is going to look. Just want to keep on applying the nice thin coats for this stage because what we want to do is blend it into the blue. You might need to rotate your miniature around to be able to hold it like this, just to get the inside of the legs. But if you have the time and the patience, feel free to attempt to blend the silver into the blue. Whether if you do it with light enough strokes and light enough paints, you'll slowly get that effect. Just make sure to keep on loading up the brush and keeping it nice and thin. Obviously near the top, what we can do is keep it nice and strong to make sure that effect really pops. What you want to do is every armour panel, roughly 1/2 to 2/3, you're going to want to get nice and silver to go down as that deep blue. Try not to get into the recesses because that's where you want the Drakenhof Nightshade to sit, which will still keep that shading to the model. As we come down, we want it to just slowly blend into that blue. Now be really careful not to get it into the lettering because we don't want to clog that up. We want to keep that nice and dark behind, so when we get around to applying the gold in the later stages, it really pops. I strongly recommend having a painting handle for this, just because otherwise you're going to be moving the miniature around into positions that might be quite difficult to hold. But just do that all over the miniature until you're happy with the effect. Don't worry if you make any mistakes this stage, because what you can go back and do is run over it again with grey night steel. As long as you do it very thin coats, it will slowly allow that blending to return. When grey night steel dries, it goes relatively blue, So it becomes very difficult to notice if there's any mistakes. So if we're doing bits like the back, what I like to do is just make a little marker and work up from it. And that way you should be able to see the nice little contrast between the silver and blue. I appreciate it's relatively subtle on the camera and will pop a little bit more in person. So we're nearly done with applying this. You can now see it's a lot clearer here, here, and on the legs. It's a little bit more subtle on the chest, and I'm just going to have to go back over there where I've gone a little bit too far down. On the back, again, it's a similar sort of story. Silver and blue, silver and blue. And that effect really distinguishes your units against any others on the battlefield. There we have it. The third stage of painting my Grey Knights complete. You can see that that blue very nicely contrasts to that silver. The last stage is just to apply an edge highlight of Stormhost Silver. This will really make the silvers pop and allow that further little bit of contrast between the silver and the blue. For this stage, I'm going to be using a medium layer brush and a small layer brush, depending on which area of the miniature I want to edge highlight. And the reason for this is I prefer using the medium layer brush when I've got some larger areas to cover. Just allows a little bit more paint on the brush for the edge highlight. Now the main thing is you don't want too much water on the brush here. You want to be able to just slowly touch the edge. And right there, I have a bit too much water on. I'm just going to take it off and roll it back onto my palette. So with edge highlighting, what you want to do is go at a right angle to the one you're brushing on and just lightly go over with the side of the brush on the edge that you wish to highlight. So on the back here, I like to utilise it. A slightly larger brush to really help those colours pop. Just going to have to move the miniature around and just be careful not to catch any other points on the mini when you're trying to edge highlight. Just take your time and do it step by step. But what you're looking for here is to go over all of the harsh edges with this highlight, which just helps them stand out that little bit more. If you make a mistake, don't worry. You can always go back over. I'd really recommend with Stormhost Silver giving it a good shake every now and then. Sometimes it separates. Just be really careful not to clip more than you're wanting to highlight. But again, don't worry if you do. You can always rectify and fix it. I always find it easier to rotate the miniature to make adding the edge highlight that little bit easier. Now the important point is you want to make sure that you're going down to the bottom all the way to where the blue is as well. Because once you do that, it really helps that blue pop. You find yourself getting to a small little angle that might require a smaller brush, switch to your small layer brush. So just continue to do this all the way until you've covered every edge you wish to on the miniature. And there we have it, completing the armour of the Grey Knight on his way to fighting demons in the warp. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking it and also subscribing to the channel. I'll be looking to post more videos on how to paint Grey Knights and finishing this model up, and other factions in the 40k universe. If you have any suggestions for the video, or just enjoyed it, please comment down below. And remember, all the items used to make this model and how to paint it will be found in the description. Have a good day, And remember, happy hobbying.